So you either tell the judges, okay, judges, if the case of coconut throwing comes up, look at the history, and you need to rule according to history. You need to rule according to the cases before. Or you say, judges, rule however you think best. You know, there's the law. You rule however you think best, no matter what it says in history. How do you mix those two?
I think maybe what you could do is maybe not create like parties, but have designate judges in different sections. So have half of the court, you know, rule by history and half of it rule by their own conscience. So you can see the best of both worlds, but not always have the same people do the same thing. You know, switch them up so it's not the same people ruling the way they want and the same people ruling by history. You mix them, and then it's never staying like simply to one side, and then you can kind of see a better result overall, I think.
So you'd have some court cases, or some courts rule according to judicial review, and some courts rule by case-by-case decision.
What I meant to say was some judges, like on the Supreme Court, have like half of the judges rule by history and judicial review, and then the other half by what they think is best.
So judges wouldn't be able to rule by conscience. It would just be like you'd be picking like, oh, you got to rule by judicial review, whether or not they think that, whether or not they feel connected to that, or they think that's right.
I think in some cases that there are points when that needs to happen, and that's why I kind of said like, don't leave everybody in the spot they're in, switch them around so they're not always just ruling to one side, that everybody has the opportunity to, you know, judge based on their own views, but then also judge based on history.
Okay. In the chat box, there's several. Jonas, just look back at past decisions to help determine or gain context on your current case. Jonas, I would say theoretically that sounds really good, but in practice, how do you enforce that? You know, if you're writing laws for how the judicial branch works, how do you say, okay, you need to look at the past, but you don't have to follow the past. You can follow your own conscience, but you need to look at the past. That's just a really watery way of saying do whatever you want, but I recommend you look at the past, right? Like if the thing with law is you're making, you know, you have to do this. So, you know, you either say you have to look to the past or you don't have to look to the past. Finding middle ground here is kind of tricky. Sally and then Anna.
Well, I agree with Caleb that we need to mix it, and I would mix it so that the Supreme Court does Coco Island and then the lower courts do Nut Island, because that's kind of how ours works. That way, if the individual circumstances are different, you're in the lower court, they can kind of see that, you know. But the reason why I did Coco Island was because I think that even though it could be kind of dangerous to have the one and done decisions, there have been court cases where they've overturned Supreme Court rulings before when they're wrong, you know, like when they ruled that what black people were people, you know, they ruled that and they said you can't sue or whatever. Well, they overturned that later, so it is possible to overturn it. And so I think this with having the judges extend constitutionality, I think that helps provide more checks and balances on the government.
Ooh, okay. So Sally brings up a good point. Well, it is kind of one and done. If Jonas makes a ruling, all of the lower courts are pretty much obligated to follow that, because if not, people will appeal it up to Jonas and he'll be like, hey, I already ruled on this, or my predecessors already ruled on this. The answer is, you know, no coconut throwing. But until, you know, Jonas's great-great-grandson takes over the Supreme Court and is like, you know what? Jonas was crazy. I'm going to change all of precedent and rule that coconut throwing is constitutional on Coconut Island, or whatever the case is. So you can change it, but it's a really big deal. Lower courts can't change it. It would have to be a future Supreme Court would have to look at the entire history. It would be like, take that entire bookshelf and topple it. All of this all of these court cases that are built around this ruling 300 years ago, or 100 years ago, or 50 years ago, we're going to topple that entire thing over. So it's possible, but it makes judges a lot more hesitant to actually do it because they're because of how much weight that's there. Okay, which system does America have? A system of judicial review or of none? Garrett, go ahead.
So I think that typically the United States tries to work by judicial review. Like, generally they do, at least the Supreme Court. They look at the precedent and say, all right, what did we decide before? But I think they also don't hold themselves to that. Like, and it's not like someone told them, you should look at history, but decide whatever you want. I think that's just something that they decided works. I don't know. But, because like Sally said, they've overturned past decisions. So I think generally mostly they try to work by judicial review, but they do allow for exceptions.
Okay, mostly they try to work for judicial review, then they allow for exceptions. So I would kind of reword that, Garrett. I think you're on the right track, which is the United States has a system of judicial review, but judicial review might not be as fixed as this brief description makes it seem. So I'm trying to paint a picture that's very black and white here, right? That shows a huge contrast from Nut Island to Coco Island. But in reality, even though the United States is a judicial review system, it is like Coco Island, judges still have the ability to make case-by-case decisions. They aren't, but they have to make case-by-case decisions after considering all of the cases in the past that have been ruled by this and having to justify their decision in accordance with rulings in the past. Otherwise, if they make a decision, they're like, I'm not really going to look at history. It'll just get appealed up to the next level, and then they'll say, actually, lower judge, you didn't look at history. The vast majority of cases in the past are decided this way. So yes, there is room for case-by-case decisions, and you can overturn a decision made by the Supreme Court, but the United States is like Coco Island. I want to show you a picture that describes this, that shows this change. Because the United States didn't start out like Coco Island. The United States started out like Coconut Island. The Supreme Court didn't know what its role was. Article 3 is like 4 paragraphs long. How are they supposed to know what that, how are they supposed to interpret that? It took them time, and it took several court cases before the Supreme Court kind of found its identity. And after it found its identity, things changed. So I want to show you a picture that's pretty crazy. This is the before and after of the Supreme Court. Before. When the Supreme Court started, it was in this basement room, kind of over here, if I have my bearings right, in the Capitol building. This tiny little basement room, there's no windows, really poor lighting. This is where cases like Marbury versus Madison were seen. Give me a check mark if you've ever been there. Have you ever been to Capitol Hill, been inside the Capitol, and seen this little basement room that's kind of tucked away? It reminds me kind of like the closet in the first Harry Potter, where Harry Potter grows up. It's like, oh yeah, where should we put the Supreme Court? Yeah, there's a room down in the basement. It's not being used. They could go down there. That was kind of how the Supreme Court was seen. They didn't really know what its job was. They're like, we need a judicial branch. We need somebody to judge things. What exactly is their power? We'll figure that out. Now, 200 years later, the Supreme Court has its own beautiful, magnificent building where the Supreme Court justices have, elaborate waiting rooms, and they have a beautiful courtroom, as well as hundreds of district court and appellate courts over the United States, in beautiful courtrooms all over the United States. the role of the Supreme Court and federal courts has changed dramatically. And I think this picture really shows a visual representation of that change from this basement little closet room to a magnificent building really changed the Supreme Court. Okay, can I have a volunteer to be a reader? Harrison. Okay, Harrison, I want you to read a quote on the next slide from Alexander Hamilton. You're welcome to read it, or you can rap hip-hop it as if you were on Broadway in the New Hamilton show. So you can choose however you want to do this. But I want you to read this quote, and I want everyone to think, which of these two versions of the Supreme Court does Hamilton see? When Alexander Hamilton's writing the Federalist Papers, how does he envision the Supreme Court? So go ahead, Harrison.
Okay, well, I'm not really a rapster, but let's go. We truly
You don't have
said
to
to have neither force nor will, but merely by judgment, and must ultimately that doesn't rhyme at all, and must ultimately depend upon the aid of the executive arm. Even for the efficiency of its judgments, Alexander Hamilton, no, 78, emphasis of the earth.